Hello and welcome back to the OrtoTech Garage. My name's Keith. Today I've got an interesting subject for you. I know this might seem very simple to you, but we're going to be talking about fluids and more specifically fluid leaks. I want to help you guys identify what's leaking on your car, give you an idea of what might be the cause of the leak, and also some of the ramifications of the leak. You know, what are the potential problems when you have something leaking? Let's go through some of those scenarios here. I've got a vehicle set up in the garage that I can kind of go through with you. I'm going to demonstrate a little bit on how to check some of these fluids while we're under there, because I can show you some samples while we're doing that. Let's get out in the garage and get after it. All right, I want to show you a few examples here of some fluids. I'm actually going to check a couple of fluids here so I can show you the condition of some that on a car that actually has some miles on it, because sometimes when the fluid is new, it's going to look a lot different than when it's used. When we're looking at the rear differential on a truck like this is a Toyota Tacoma. It's got a solid rear axle in it. And there's a couple of spots where this differential oil can leak. Sometimes around the drain plug or the fill plug, if the gasket were bad on it, it could leak. On the front end of this rear end, there's a pinion seal that has a tendency to leak from time to time. And then another spot you might notice is going to be back here at the end of the axles. Okay, so where the axles go into the actual axle housing, there are some seals on there, and it's very common for them to leak on these Tacomas as well. So if I were looking for this gear oil leak somewhere, we want to identify what part of the car it's coming from. Anything that's coming from back here in the back axle is leaking this type of fluid, this rear differential oil. So it travels down through this axle tube, and it'll actually come out the ends on both sides and sometimes coat the brakes with gear oil, which makes the brakes grabby and sticky and doing weird things. So let's get a look here. I'm going to pull the plug. I'll show you how the fluid gets checked on this as well, and then you'll know how to do it and know what it looks like. So here's the drain plug, here's the fill plug. And this is also the check plug. We want oil to be right at the bottom of this hole. So you can see right here, this fluid is actually perfect. Just as I pull this plug out, it's just starting to drip out of here, okay? And we don't want it any more full than that. Right at the bottom of this hole, right about there, that's where the fluid level is supposed to be. And it comes all the way across here. It's going to be all the way down on both sides. So we just want what you see here. Means the fluid level is perfect. If I take a little sample here, my glove is fairly clean. You can see on here that the fluid is almost a clear color. It's a little bit dirty right there, but the fluid is basically clear. It looks a lot like engine oil. So sometimes it's hard to determine, based on just the color alone, what's leaking on there. But you want to find the location on the car is really going to help you pinpoint where your leak's coming from. See anything in the back end over here? I'm almost guaranteed it's going to be differential oil, gear oil, unless you're somewhere around the gas tank and you're smelling gas. Obviously that would be a different scenario. The gas tank is right here, but if you've got oil coming out, look here in this differential area. So there is another possibility of fluid leaking back here. It would be brake fluid. You do have brake hoses coming here from the body to the rear axle housing, and then going to both sides there are some steel brake lines, and then inside here behind these backing plates there are wheel cylinders in there. Those wheel cylinders can leak. It's more common that they stay contained within the brake drum in there, but if they're leaking really bad, you might actually see a little bit of fluid dripping on here on the edge of the backing plate towards the bottom. They'd have to be really covered in brake fluid for that to happen. Like I said, that's pretty rare on these, but it is a possibility, so I just wanted to mention that before I let you run. I'm standing here just forward of the rear axle on this vehicle, and you'll notice here the gas tank starts about midway on this car and then extends all the way to the rear axle. This is another potential spot for leakage. You could be leaking fuel. Sometimes the fuel pump assembly leaks at the top of it, and it may be coming from the very top of the gas tank and dripping down. Again, you should see some signs of leakage, something wet on the gas tank itself, possibly on the fuel lines if the lines were leaking on it. But either way, gasoline is a little bit difficult to identify just by its look because it looks clear. It looks almost like just a tinted water, really. But the odor should give it away. You know, gasoline has got a very strong smell to it. I think everybody understands what that smells like. You know, you're at the gas station, you can smell it right away, and those are just vapors you're smelling. If you have wet fuel somewhere or even gas vapor, it's a very strong odor. So use your nose to help you identify that particular leak and separate it from something else. On this vehicle, it has a four-wheel drive, so it has some extra components on it. One of them is the transfer case. This transfer case here also holds a gear oil. It looks identical to what you'll see in the rear differential. The weight of it is a little bit different on this particular vehicle, but the oil looks identical. So it's gonna have that clear to yellowish tint to it, almost like a motor oil. But keep in mind that gear oil also has a very distinct odor. It almost smells a little bit rotten, I guess, if I were to try to describe it. Let me show you what this fluid looks like on this vehicle. We're gonna pull this check plug out. It's going to be a lot like the differential oil. We just want it to fill to the bottom of the hole. Now I'm going to let this out pretty slow, and you can see it's starting to ooze out. Hopefully you can see the distinct color on it. And you can see how fast it's coming out because it's a little bit warm. I don't want to let too much more out. And this is almost a yellowish to brownish tint to it, probably because it could use a service on it. This truck's got about 35,000 miles on it. And that would be what you'd be looking for. Some potential spots of leakage would be here around the seal at the tail end of this transfer case. Sometimes the seam can leak where the case can be separated. Look for leaking drain plug gaskets or fill plug gaskets. They both have a metal seal on these plugs. And then also it could be leaking right in between the engine and transmission, right about here. If you had the front seal and the transfer case were leaking, it's possible to see some fluid coming out in this area. So generally when you have a vehicle like this, they should be very dry. So you could see even the dust just kind of settling on everything. There's no wet spots anywhere. Those wet spots will be a good indication that you've got something leaking. There shouldn't be anything looking damp or wet underneath the vehicle. As I work my way forward here, the next component in the lineup is the transmission itself. This has got an automatic transmission mated to the transfer case because it's all-wheel drive. This whole engine and transmission is mounted longitudinally, which means everything kind of runs front to back. If this were a front-wheel drive car, the transmission would be mounted a little bit closer to the wheels in the front. But we're right here in the midsection of the car. This transmission has a pan on it, and this fluid leaks could come from anywhere on this transmission. So the pan is a common area, this black piece that's on here. It's possible also to leak in that same spot in between the transfer case and the transmission where I showed you just previously. The only difference is the fluid would be a different color. So transmission fluid, automatic transmission fluid particularly, is a pink or red. As it wears over time and starts to accumulate debris and clutch material and things, it'll start to darken. So you'll see it change to a brownish color and eventually black if you let it go that long. So it's important to know what condition your fluid is in if you're searching for a leak. On this particular vehicle, I can pop the check plug a little bit and just get a tiny sample to show you what it looks like. This way you have an idea what you're looking for. So if your vehicle is leaking something dark, it's possible it could be transmission fluid if it's completely dirty. I'm just going to pull this down a tiny bit. I don't want to take it out because I don't want to lose any fluid, but I do want to get enough to give you a little sample. And a lot of times I'll do this if somebody's in for a service. I'll be checking the fluid level like this. I just want to get a sample of the fluid. So if you can see, it's a pinkish color. It's not black or brown at all. It's actually got a nice tint to it. This fluid is fairly clean. It's important that you know exactly what your fluid looks like when you're trying to identify a leak. If you're seeing black fluid around the transmission pan and your fluid is pink, that's obviously not the fluid. Just a little tip for you. The next component on this all-wheel drive vehicle or four-wheel drive vehicle I want to show you is the front differential. The front differential connects to the drive line, which goes all the way back to the transfer case, and it's supplying power to the front wheels through these axles. There's one on either side. So there's a few places that can leak on here as well. One of them would be up in here where there's another pinion seal. There are axle seals in between the axle and the differential itself, and then again on the other side. And this axle tube will have oil in it, a lot like the rear axle did. There's also a drain plug here and a fill plug. It's possible either one of those could be leaking. And then one last spot would be the mating surface between the two halves of this case on here. So this would be a spot that might be prone to leakage as well. If that's leaking, you'd have to pull the differential apart and reseal it. There's a couple other little bits that bolt onto that as well. Anything that bolts to that housing will have some kind of gasket or seal on it, and those all have a potential to leak over time. Those would be the common areas. Again, the differential oil would look same to what I showed you before. We'll check this one so you can get an idea of how to check the fluid and determine what the fluid looks like, so you can see if it matches what you're seeing on the ground. Okay. This will be a lot like the differential that we looked at in the rear and the transfer case that we looked at as well. We're just going to pull this out, and the fluid level should be right to the bottom of the hole here. So I'll take my pinky, and I like to stick it in here and wrap it around just a tiny bit and see what we get. Okay, so this oil level is actually a tad low on here, but I am getting a sample on it. I hope you can see that. It's very clear, so it's pretty clean. Maybe just a tiny bit low, a couple millimeters in depth below the hole. So nothing to be too alarmed about, but again, it's very clear, very difficult to tell what it is. If you're seeing that on the ground, it's hard to tell if that's oil or differential fluid. Heck, it even looks like brake fluid sometimes. You know, you really need to pinpoint the location that you're seeing something dripping and then try to trace it back to the source. Just telling by the fluid alone sometimes doesn't tell you the whole story. I want to show you here, if you can see that it does have this metal drain plug gasket on it. Sometimes these get crushed too often and then they start to leak, so keep an eye on that. Connected to those differential components are the axles. So there's an axle here, and it has a boot on it and a boot over here. So we call that the inboard boot and the outboard boot. These have grease trapped within them to lubricate the bearings inside. These boots have a potential to rip and spit grease out of them. I have a great demonstration for you here on the other side I want to show you. But they should look dry like this side. Everything is looking good on here. Another spot you might see some leakage will be coming from the brakes over here. There's a caliper, a brake hose, brake lines. The brake fluid could possibly be leaking in this area, maybe dripping onto a tire or rim or something. So you want to keep an eye on all these areas. Everything should be dry like you see on this side. Let's walk to the other side. And you can see here we have some axle grease coming out of this axle boot here. So it's starting to make a mess in and around the brake caliper. It's kind of flinging around. This wheel will turn. The faster you go, the faster it spins, and it'll throw some grease out of that torn boot and kind of fling it everywhere, making a mess. So axle grease generally is not going to drip on the ground unless it's really warm. It has to be heated up pretty well to get it to the point where it wants to drip, but it will leave these specks and mess everywhere. And so that's how you would identify if you had a leak in your axle boot or your CB boot. Another area that you can take a look at, sometimes you'll see a bit of wetness, kind of like the CB boot. It generally won't be leaking to the point where it's dripping on the ground, but it is possible, especially on a truck like this. This has some coilover shocks on it, and they're aftermarket. This is kind of like a lifted truck with performance parts on it. They hold quite a bit of oil in these, so I've seen these leak where they can actually start to drip off the bottom of the shock absorber. So it's a good idea to take a look up there. If you see anything wet on the shock absorber or the strut assembly, it's possible that that component is leaking internally. Some pumping some of that oil out, and it's going to run down along the shock or the strut. So good idea to take a look at those too. They should be dry like this one. Another potential source for leaks could actually be suspension bushings. This particular vehicle does not have liquid-filled bushings. So on here, this piece is the control arm. The control arm has bushings where they mount in here to the frame. There are some cars out there, BMWs, Subarus, other makes as well, that have liquid-filled bushings in them. And once the bushings tear, the liquid will actually come out and leak onto the ground. I know it sounds odd, but it's possible if you have some oil leaking on the ground, it could be coming from suspension bushings as well. As long as we're talking about odd components to leak, like suspension bushings, I should mention also It's possible that you have a liquid-filled engine mount or two on your vehicle. Same thing, they have oil inside the rubber. If the rubber splits, it's possible for that oil to come out and start to leak onto the mount and below it. You can look up here, you'll see there's an engine mount. This one does not have liquid-filled mounts on it, but it's another potential source for a problem. Where I'm standing here is pretty close to where that engine mount is that you just looked at. There is a little hose that pops out of the firewall. The firewall is the separation between the passenger compartment and the engine compartment. So right coming through that firewall is a short little hose, and that hose is the drain for the air conditioning evaporator. So just like water condenses on your glass on a humid day, if you've got a nice ice cold glass of lemonade and you see all the water dripping off and it's all over your table and stuff, the same thing occurs in your air conditioning system on a humid day. Is you'll have water condensation on the evaporator, and that water needs to drain out. So it'll come off the evaporator, it'll drip down into the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning box, and that box has to drain somewhere. So usually there's a hose sticking out somewhere through the firewall, like this one, and that hose is going to drip water consistently out of it, especially on a very humid day. And the reason I mention this to you guys is that I can't tell you how many times this has happened over the years. We live in Las Vegas. We have a very low humidity here. It's very rare to have water dripping out of that drain hose. But I can tell you the very first humid day in summer, I get loads of people on my doorstep telling me they've got a leak. And they don't have a leak. What they have is normal condensation dripping out of the evaporator drain because it's the first humid day they've experienced in a long time. And we usually have to inspect it for them and then, let them know exactly what's going on so they're not nervous about that in the future. It is normal to see a giant puddle of water under your car, especially on the passenger side. That's where these are generally located. So if you've got a giant puddle behind your right front tire on the passenger side, a lot of times that's just your air conditioning and condensation dripping out the drain hole. So keep an eye on that as well. While I'm on the topic of water leaking out from underneath your car, it is possible to get some water out of your exhaust system. Now, water is one of the natural byproducts of the combustion process, so your exhaust has always got some water in it. A lot of times you'll see it dripping out the tailpipe. There are times when it won't make it to the tailpipe. If you have an exhaust leak somewhere, or I wanted to show you here, this muffler here, a lot of times they put a little drain hole right in the bottom of it. And if you've got, depending on the car, sometimes you can get a little bit of a drip of water, a pretty consistent drip out of the little pinholes in the muffler. Any kind of seam somewhere is possible to get some accumulation of that water. And if you're seeing something dripping from your exhaust, chances are that's what it is. Now, it's possible you've got some internal engine leak and you've got coolant leaking into your exhaust or something, but you would have some other symptoms with that. If all you're seeing is a little bit of wetness around your muffler or some spot on the exhaust system, that's probably just normal water condensation and nothing to worry about. I'd like to talk to you guys about coolant or antifreeze for just a moment. I want to clarify a couple of things. One, engine coolant and engine antifreeze are the same thing. So we're in a hot climate here where we live. We call it coolant all the time because we don't really freeze at all. But it's identical to what you're going to find up in the northern part of North America, Europe, wherever you guys are at. But it's important that you understand that these coolants, although they function similar, they're very different in chemical composition. So there's a lot of different coolants out there. Coolants come in many colors, and just because you see a particular color on the ground doesn't necessarily mean it's coolant. So it's really important that you do what I recommended earlier in this video, that you check your coolant, see what color it is, and then help identify your leak in that manner. If you've got pink coolant and you see something green on the ground, well, it's not your coolant. That came from somebody else's car, so take a peek at that as well. When it comes to coolant leaks, they can come from just about anywhere. From the front half of the vehicle will really be where you would be isolating some of that stuff, depending on your car. Now, if you're driving a Porsche and you've got the engine in the back and you've got radiators in the front, well, the opportunities for leaks around that vehicle are endless. It could be anywhere on that car. So really just model specific. Make sure that you're identifying what kind of coolant you have, and then you're going to really have to look hard to see what's leaking coolant somewhere. It could literally be anywhere. There's hoses at the firewall. There's coolant that could leak inside your car. If your heater core is leaking, you might see coolant on the passenger's floorboard. Even on the driver's side, it's possible. It's soaking your carpet, so the potentials are endless on there. when we get a vehicle in and we have a coolant leak, we're usually going to pressure test the system. We're going to pump that up, put some pressure on it, about 15 pounds or so probably, and then just try to identify where it's dripping and where it's leaking from. Another thing you might notice if you've got a coolant leak is a bit of a sweet smell, especially if you're in the interior. That could indicate you've got a heater core that's leaking inside the car, inside the heating, ventilation, air conditioning box. You might see some signs of that coolant dripping out the evaporator drain, which I talked to you a little bit about earlier. That coolant could be coming out that hole as well. So it's really important if you got a coolant leak, you get that taken care of right away. Don't drive your vehicle if it's low on coolant. You really run the risk of doing some serious engine damage to it if you have that kind of problem going on. Let's talk about power steering leaks for just a moment. A lot of cars are going to have a hydraulic power steering system on it. If you have that kind of system, you'll have some fluid in it. The fluid will go from the pump through hoses into the steering rack or steering gearbox, depending on how old your car is. And those are all potential sources for leaks on there. On this particular vehicle, this has a steering rack and pinion system in it. This is the end of the rack, and this boot covers the inner tie rod and the end of the steering rack where there's a seal in there. A lot of times, these little bellows boots will fill up with power steering fluid, and they won't quite drip on the ground right away. They'll just start to slowly fill up with oil. And then over time, as they get full, they'll start to pump the oil out of them. So if you see any wetness around the bellows boots on your steering rack, that usually means the steering rack is leaking. Check your fluid. It'll probably be a little bit low. And again, match the colors up. As far as power steering fluids go, there's another variety of colors on these. Vehicles like this one usually take automatic transmission fluid, the red variety, just your standard transmission fluid. You can buy specific power steering fluids as well. Some of them come in a clear to yellowy color. They look like oil. There's all kinds of fluids out there. You know, I can't stress enough, if you are working on your own vehicle, make sure you're putting the right fluids in it. Not every car takes exactly the same thing. I know Hondas are a big one. There's a special fluid formula for Honda power steering systems, Honda and Acura. So I want to make sure you're installing the right fluid on the car by looking up the application on it and purchasing the right stuff for it. So again, with the fluid leaks on the power steering, all bets are off. It could be red, it could be clear, and it could be something else. I know it's not the best answer for you, but it really just depends on the make and model. Here you can get a good look at a power steering pump and its hoses that connect to it. That could leak from the front of the pump, from the housing on it, or from anywhere where a hose connects to it. While I'm in this area of the vehicle, I've got a battery here in front of me, and you can see on this one it's a little bit wet on top of it. Yes, it's got fluid in it. This is a liquid-filled battery. It's got some acid in there, and they have a potential to leak. So some of these batteries, when they start to leak acid, they can corrode everything below it. So it'll eat away at metal, it'll eat away at paint, it'll eat away at your wiring harness, everything. So it's really important you take a look at your battery from time to time. Make sure it's not leaking battery acid. If you have a dry cell battery, good on you, no big deal. But if you got a liquid-filled lead acid battery like this one, you've definitely got a potential for leakage in this thing that's just made out of plastic, the housing. If it gets a crack in it, that fluid's coming out, and not only you're going to have a fluid leak that's going to start to corrode everything below it, but you're also going to have a bad battery. So definitely keep an eye on these things. It's normal to see a little bit of corrosion like this one on top, or some of the acid is starting to bubble out a little bit. That in itself is not a huge problem if you keep an eye on it. But definitely if this thing is full of acid on top of it, you want to just replace the battery, get rid of this thing, and put a new one in there. I'm over here to one of the final fluids I can talk about for you, and this is going to be washer fluid. I know it sounds a little weird. We all know what washer fluid looks like. It's generally going to be blue. It'll have a little soapy consistency to it. Most common time you're going to find a leak here is when you're using the washer fluid. So it's possible the reservoir has a leak in it. A lot of times they'll mount the pump in the bottom of the washer fluid reservoir. The pump has a seal or gasket on it. Even the pump has a tendency to leak from time to time if they start to corrode and break down. So you could have a leak somewhere in this area. More common though, when you press your washer to activate it, you'll get some water spraying out in the wrong spots. And also, it's good to know that this water has to go somewhere. You know, I've had people tell me, when I use my washer fluid, I get a puddle of liquid on the ground, and that's going to be normal. It doesn't have anywhere else to go. It's spraying up on your windshield, and then it's eventually going to drain itself back to the ground. So you should be looking for that. It's got to go somewhere. All right, there's one last fluid that I want to talk to you about. I don't know if you technically call it a fluid or not, but it's air conditioning refrigerant. This one is terribly difficult to diagnose, especially for the do-it-yourselfer at home. It's not something that you're going to be able to see. It's not going to drip on the ground. Once the pressure is removed from refrigerant or freon, however you want to call it, once the pressure is removed from it, it's going to turn into a gas. It's pretty much odorless and colorless. It doesn't leave a puddle on the ground. The only thing that you might see from an air conditioning leak would be some oil accumulation around a hose or a fitting somewhere where the refrigerant has pulled some of the air conditioning oil out of the system with it. So that oil accumulation will eventually build up a little bit around a leaking area somewhere. So usually if we see a hose somewhere that seems to be wet for a few inches distance, there's probably a leak somewhere in that area. Some of the methods that we use to diagnose that generally be like a ultraviolet dye, where the manufacturer allows us to do that. Some manufacturers don't want you to put dye in their system, so that's not really an option for those. And then we have to move over to basically a leak detection sniffer. It's going to analyze the gases that are in the area. So we'll have to take this wand and go around all the fittings and every location where there's refrigerant to see if the machine can detect a leak somewhere. So those are kind of the methods that we'd use. You're either going to do a visual inspection, you'll see some wetness, we'll see some ultraviolet dye leak out somewhere over time, or we'll have to sniff it out using a probe. I know I probably haven't covered every single fluid on the planet, but this should give you a good basis of everything that's in most cars. Obviously, if you don't have a four-wheel drive, some of that stuff won't apply to you, but hopefully this gives you a good foundation, a good basic overview of what you might see on your car and how to identify it, and then how to go about figuring out what's leaking on it. That can also be a little bit tricky sometimes without the use of a lift or a way to get underneath the car. So obviously anytime you need some assistance, make sure you seek out your local service provider.